I thought I was just being helpful when I moved in, bringing comfort chores and memories into their too modern home. My daughter had asked me gently at first if I'd consider staying with them for a while. Just until things settle, she'd said. Her husband had nodded in agreement, his smile tight and eyes wandering to his phone. I told myself I wasn't a burden. After all, I still had strong legs, a clear mind, and hands that knew how to make soup from scratch. They had just had their second baby. The house was loud and cluttered with the beautiful chaos of early parenting. I remembered those days myself when silence was rarer than diamonds and a warm meal felt like grace. I brought my favorite tea canister, a handmade quilt, and the old toothbrush holder from my house, worn smooth with time and repetition. My daughter rolled her eyes at it, laughing in that soft, teasing way. "You and your relics," she said. I laughed too, not realizing I'd soon become one of them. The first few weeks felt good. I'd rise early, let them sleep in, make coffee, fold the laundry. No one asked me to touch. I found joy in tiny things, the way my granddaughter curled into me on the couch. Without words, the smell of cinnamon rising from the oven, the sigh of clean sheets. I didn't think much of it when they forgot to include me in movie night, or when dinner conversations swirled around careers and tech news and terms I didn't recognize. I just washed the dishes, humming to myself like I always had. There was a moment, a very small one, that sticks with me now. My son-in-law came home one day, stressed from work. He tossed his bag on the floor and kicked off his shoes. I bent down to line them neatly on the mat, just like I used to do for my husband. He looked at me and didn't say thank you. Instead, he said, "Wow, it's like we have a live-in maid." Then he laughed, not cruelly, not kindly either. My daughter giggled, but there was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes. I ignored it, pretending I hadn't heard. That night, I made lasagna from scratch. They said it was delicious. But I ate mine alone in the kitchen, while they sat on the couch scrolling and murmuring. I began to notice the pattern. I wasn't mom anymore. I wasn't grandma. I was someone they lived beside, not with. Someone who kept the fridge full, the baby changed the towels, folded. Once I tried to suggest a new curtain color for the nursery, and my daughter laughed. "You don't really get our aesthetic." I nodded, swallowing something bitter. That night, I dreamed I was walking through my childhood home, but all the furniture had been pushed to the edges and no one noticed I was there. Still, I stayed. I told myself love means sacrifice. That maybe I was overthinking. Maybe this is just how grown children are, busy, distracted, tired. But one morning my granddaughter came to me with her coloring book. "Grandma, are you the maid?" she asked. Her voice was innocent, not cruel. She just wanted to understand. I froze, the dish rag still wet in my hand. I looked at her, that little face so full of wonder, and I didn't know what to say. I laughed a little and changed the subject, but the word stayed. Maid. Not mother, not family, maid. And suddenly my hands felt older than they had the day before. It started with small things, and don't they always? A dinner plate unplaced for me, a half-hearted hi that used to be a warm hug. I'd spent so many years holding my daughter when the world felt too sharp for her. And now I couldn't even catch her eye across the dinner table. They'd say they were busy, stressed, tired, and maybe they were. But I knew the difference between stress and distance, between a forgotten word and a silence meant to reshape you. I would sit at that long oak table, the one I'd helped them pick out, and wait for someone to remember I was still there. One evening stands out. I'd cooked roast chicken just the way my daughter used to beg for when she was little. She didn't even notice it. She and her husband ordered sushi instead. "Didn't want to trouble you tonight," she said, unwrapping soy sauce packets. But the chicken sat there on the stove, still steaming, as if waiting for someone to acknowledge the effort. the memory, the love. I ate a thigh by myself quietly while they talked about some influencer's wedding and the new modular couch they wanted. Sometimes I wonder if love becomes invisible when it stops being useful. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe people forget to look back once they've moved forward. My granddaughter once asked if I used to have a job. I told her yes, I worked at the library. She blinked. Like with real books, I nodded and smiled. She looked fascinated, like I'd told her I used to speak to ghosts. Maybe I did. After a while, I started skipping dinner. I'd eat early and wash up before they even came home. That way I wouldn't have to hear them say, "Oh, you didn't have to do that." Because I did. If I didn't, no one else would. One night, my daughter came home and sighed loudly. "There's no wine left." I offered to go get some. She said, "No offense, Mom, but you don't really know what kind we like." I don't know what they like. I used to know every dream she whispered into her pillow as a child, every favorite bedtime story, every nightmare that made her cry out for me in the dark. I used to know the smell of her hair, the sound of her footsteps down the hallway. I knew the shape of her heart, but I didn't know their wine. And somehow, that made me irrelevant. They had a dinner party one Saturday. I wasn't invited, though. It was in the house I slept in. I stayed upstairs folding laundry while laughter echoed up through the floorboards. At one point, I came down to grab a towel and heard someone ask, "Who's that?" My son-in-law's voice, clear and thoughtless, replied, "That's just the maid. Ignore her. Just the maid." Again. It didn't even sting this time. It settled, like dust on a windowsill, quiet, persistent, dull. I finished folding the towels. Later, after the guests left, I found a lipstick-stained glass by the sink. I washed it slowly, staring at the pink smear as if it might explain something. When my daughter walked in and saw me scrubbing, she said, "You really don't have to do all this." But she didn't stop me. She never stopped me. It was then I began to realize I wasn't being helpful. I was being used. And worse, I had let it happen. I had offered myself on a plate not out of weakness but out of love. Love that had been taken and diluted until all that remained was labor. Quiet labor, expected labor, unthanked labor. They didn't see me, not really. They saw what I did. The clean towels, the cooked meals, the swept floors, but not the hands, not the heart, not the person. At night I began staring at the ceiling a little longer. I started writing in my journal again. Just small notes, observations, feelings I hadn't allowed myself to name. I wrote, They don't mean to be cruel, but they also don't care if they are. And that somehow felt worse than malice. I stopped putting my toothbrush in the shared holder. I moved it to a cup in my room. I started drinking my tea before they woke up. I kept thinking if I disappeared tomorrow, would they even notice? Or would the laundry just pile up until they hired someone else? And if the only thing tethering you to a home is what you clean and not who you are, is it really a home at all? The first time I heard it, really heard it, I was standing in the hallway with my granddaughter's favorite pajamas in my wrinkled hands. They were soft, pale pink, with little white rabbits printed across the chest, and she had spilled juice on them that morning. I'd just finished hand-washing them in the sink because the fabric was delicate, and I didn't want them to lose their shape in the machine. I was holding them like a mother holds something sacred, something small and soft and worth preserving. Then I heard my son-in-law's voice drift in from the living room. "She's just the maid, you know," he said, in that dismissive half-laughing tone that people use when they think the subject of the joke can't hear them or won't matter if they do. My daughter didn't respond right away, and that silence, that awful stretched silence, hurt worse than if she'd joined in. Then I heard her murmur, Don't say that, but it wasn't firm, it wasn't indignant, it wasn't enough. It was a whisper thrown into a void, like tossing a paper umbrella into a storm. He just laughed again, louder this time, and I heard the flick of a bottle cap, the low rumble of the television. I stood there with those little rabbit pajamas in my hand, and something broke in me, not loudly but quietly, the way a porcelain plate cracks down the center, while still sitting on the shelf. I felt myself go still, so completely still. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just looked at the fabric in my hands and thought about how many times I had bent over backwards to be useful, how I had traded my retirement for relevance, and all it had earned me was a title I never agreed to wear. The maid. Not mother, not grandma, not matriarch or memory keeper or gentle hand in the storm. The maid. I brought the pajamas upstairs and laid them gently across the bed. My knees ached as I sat down beside them. I looked at my hands, old-veined, lined with history. These hands had cupped fevered foreheads, written grocery lists, packed school lunches, buried a husband. They had held my daughter through colic puberty, heartbreak, childbirth. They had shaped her world. And now those same hands were invisible, taken for granted, reduced to service. Later that evening, I asked my daughter very softly if she thought of me that way, her brows furrowed in confusion. What way, she asked. I didn't want to say it out loud. I couldn't. So I just looked at her, really looked at her, and she flinched. She knew. She said, "You know we're grateful, right? But grateful isn't the same as loving. It's not even close." She poured herself a glass of wine and walked away before I could answer. I stood in the hallway feeling smaller than I had in years, not because I was weak, but because I was shrinking to fit inside the version of me they wanted. Quiet, useful, unseen. That night I wrote one line in my journal, "If I am only what I give, what happens when I stop?" In the days that followed, I tried to test that question. I stopped putting away the laundry. No one noticed. I stopped making coffee. He muttered about needing to order a new machine. I stopped tidying up the shoes at the door. They piled into a chaotic heap. Still no one asked me if something was wrong. No one looked up from their phones, their emails, their little curated lives of productivity and style. One morning I sat outside in the backyard instead of doing the dishes. The air was crisp, and the jasmine was blooming along the fence line. I remembered the scent from my own garden years ago. I used to plant jasmine near the porch to remind myself that something could always bloom even in poor soil. I closed my eyes and breathed it in deeply. Inside I could hear the baby crying, my daughter's voice rising sharp with stress. I heard her call out for me once, twice. Then the third time, "Mom, are you going to help or what?" "Not." "Can you help? Not. Would you mind?" "But are you going to?" Like an employee late for her shift. I didn't answer. I just sat still, listening to the wind move through the branches. I was no longer interested in answering to a role I hadn't signed up for. I was no longer interested in being summoned. The pajamas were dry by then. I left them folded neatly on the stairs. And that night I did not make dinner. I read a book instead. I wiped their counters and bit my tongue, while they hosted guests, never once introducing me as anything but background. At first I told myself it was politeness. Maybe they didn't want to overwhelm visitors, or maybe they thought I preferred to stay behind the scenes. But the more it happened, the more obvious it became. I wasn't introduced at all. I was simply there, present, but invisible, part of the furniture, part of the help. They'd throw their little cocktail nights with their white wine and minimalist glassware, talking about modern parenting strategies and brunch spots and startup investments, I'd be the one making sure the glasses were clean, the cheese board was full, the crumbs swept up behind them. I wasn't asked to help. I just knew that if I didn't, no one would. And if I did, at least things stayed gentle, peaceful, tidy. But even that logic started to rot, because when someone doesn't ask you but expects you, that's no longer kindness. That's entitlement dressed in silence. One night, a guest looked at me as I walked past with a tray of empty cups and asked, "Oh, is she your nanny?" My daughter let out a little laugh. "No," she said. "That's just my mom. She likes to help. Just my mom." The way she said it, it landed like a label, like a shrug. Not the woman who raised me, not the reason I'm standing here in this house I didn't build, just likes to help. As if my presence here was a hobby, as if this servitude was something I sought out for entertainment. I didn't say a word. I just kept walking to the kitchen, washed the glasses, and stared out the window at the darkened garden, lit only by the flicker of their designer string lights. I used to imagine retiring near the ocean. I used to dream of opening a small bookstore, volunteering at the library, taking watercolor classes. My life had become a series of chores handed to me by the very people I once carried on my back. There's something uniquely painful about watching people you love morph into strangers, not because they've changed, but because they've grown comfortable treating you as less. My daughter still kissed me on the cheek sometimes, still texted me photos of the kids, but they were digital gestures, easy, detached. Love requires attention, effort, acknowledgement, and none of those things were showing up at my door. The next morning I tried to talk to her. We were folding laundry together, or I was folding, and she was scrolling through her phone. I said, "Do you ever miss the way things used to be?" She glanced at me and said, "What do you mean?" I hesitated, afraid to push too hard, but I gently said, "When we used to talk more, when we laughed, when I was more than just someone keeping the house in order." She didn't look up, just said, "Things change, Mom. We all have roles. That's life." Roles. Like I'd been cast in some play I hadn't auditioned for. She left the room soon after, and I just stood there, holding a tiny sock in my hand and wondering how I'd gone from being the director of a family to a stagehand in someone else's performance. That day I stopped wiping the counters, just stopped, let the crumbs sit. The next day they were still there, and the next, and then slowly the complaints began. "Didn't we clean this already?" "Why does it smell weird in here?" "Mom, could you?" I said no, just once. Quietly, gently, a small, firm no. The room froze. It was like I'd broken some invisible law. My son-in-law raised an eyebrow. My daughter stared at me like I'd spoken in tongues. But I didn't explain. I just stood there calm. I think they expected me to apologize. I didn't. I went to my room and lit a candle. I read. I took a nap. It was the first nap I'd taken in that house that didn't feel like defeat. It felt like resistance. That evening they ordered takeout. I didn't offer to set the table. I didn't offer to wash the dishes. I didn't even ask what they wanted to watch on television. I stayed upstairs and looked through my old photo albums instead. Pictures of me holding my daughter as a baby, of birthday cakes I baked by hand, of scraped knees I bandaged, of bedtime stories I read over and over until my voice went hoarse. And then I looked in the mirror. My face had aged, yes, but it still held the same eyes that once glowed with pride when my daughter got her first job. The same lips that used to kiss away her fears. The same hands that held her steady while she learned how to walk. The woman staring back at me in that mirror was not a maid. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman with dignity. And I decided right then I would stop living like I had none. I began noticing how they'd leave messes on purpose, like testing how far I'd bend without ever breaking. It wasn't overt, no slammed doors or shouted words. It was subtle, a kind of quiet rebellion that whispered beneath the surface of every shared space. Dirty dishes stacked just outside the sink, crumbs left on the counters that no one bothered to wipe laundry, tossed carelessly on the floor, rather than folded or put away. They seemed to know I would pick up after them like clockwork, like a ghost haunting their lives with a broom and mop, and so they left behind their signs of neglect, daring me to say something to push back. I remember one morning the kitchen table was littered with empty coffee cups and takeout wrappers, and a half-eaten sandwich abandoned under a napkin. My granddaughter's juice glass, sticky and smeared, sat precariously at the edge. I cleaned it all up, moving slowly, my bones, aching, my heart heavier than the cloth I wiped with. I thought maybe this is just the way life is now, messy, complicated, and unappreciated. But somewhere deep inside a quiet ember was beginning to glow. Later that week, I found muddy footprints on the pristine hardwood floor. Not little ones, the big boots of my son-in-law, tracking dirt through the house without a care. When I pointed it out to my daughter, she said, "He was rushing. He didn't see it." I didn't say a word. I just cleaned it up again. But it wasn't just the messes. It was the silence that followed. The absence of thanks. The avoidance of eye contact, the way my efforts were expected, not noticed. It was as if I had become a fixture, a background noise necessary, but unvalued. One afternoon, I tried to explain how I felt. I told them I'm tired. I feel invisible. My daughter's eyes flickered with guilt for a moment before she looked away. "We're busy, Mom," she said. "You don't have to do everything." But I knew the truth. I did have to do everything, because no one else would. There was a growing tension inside me, like the pressure building before a storm. I didn't want to be angry. I didn't want to be bitter. I just wanted to be seen, really seen as the woman who had given her life for this family. The woman who deserved more than crumbs and corners. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the silence wrapping around me like a cold shroud. I thought about the years spent cleaning, cooking, carrying the sacrifices made in the name of love, and I realized something. Love, when it's one-sided, can become a chain, a burden, a slow erasure of self. I decided then that I wouldn't let that happen. I wouldn't disappear into the background anymore. I wouldn't let them reduce me to a shadow, a ghost, a maid. The next morning I didn't clean. I didn't tidy up. I didn't even make coffee. They noticed. They asked. They complained. But I stood firm, quiet, but resolute, letting the dust settle where it might. And in that stillness I found a small freedom, the first breath of self-respect, after years of holding my silence. The day I collapsed from cleaning their bathroom grout, no one asked if I was okay. They just asked if I'd finished. It was a damp, cold morning when my legs gave way beneath me, a sudden weakness that sent me down onto the tile floor with a soft thud. The grout I had been scrubbing so tirelessly was now smeared with the imprint of my palm, and for a moment the world spun slow and cruel. I lay there, breath shallow, heart pounding, waiting for a hand to reach down, a voice, to ask if I was all right. But instead, the only sound was my daughter's footsteps, hurrying past, her voice calling, "Mom, are you done with the bathroom yet? We need to get ready." I pushed myself up, each movement a reminder of the years etched into my bones. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that I'd rested enough. But inside, a flicker of something else, a quiet anger, a dawning awareness that I was expected to give until I had nothing left, that my needs, my pain were invisible. Later I sat in my room, legs wrapped around a pillow, my hands trembling. I thought about the life I'd led before moving in with them, the mornings filled with gardening, the afternoons spent reading in the sun, the evenings with a cup of tea, and my own thoughts. That life felt like a distant memory, a shadow slipping through my fingers. The next day, my daughter asked if I was feeling better. I smiled weakly and nodded, but I didn't mention the ache deep in my chest or the way my spirit had bruised. She didn't ask again. No one did. From that day on, I began to guard my strength carefully. I stopped volunteering for the heaviest chores. I let the dust gather in corners they never saw. I stopped rushing to fix every little mess, and I noticed how the house shifted not with gratitude but with discomfort. They were unsettled by my refusal to be their silent servant. I remember one afternoon my son-in-law asked, "Why are you sitting so much these days?" I looked at him tired, but resolute, and said nothing, because the answer was complicated, wrapped in years of unnoticed labor and fading respect. I found myself dreaming again, not of the past, but of a future where I mattered beyond the chores I performed, where my presence was honored, not tolerated, where love wasn't a transaction but a true connection. It was a slow awakening, painful and humbling, but necessary. One evening, as I sat quietly knitting by the window, my granddaughter climbed onto my lap. She looked up at me with wide, innocent eyes and whispered, "Anma, are you tired?" I nodded, tears pricking the edges of my eyes. She hugged me tightly, and in that small moment I felt a flicker of warmth. But I knew it wasn't enough. I needed more than fleeting moments. I needed respect. I needed acknowledgement. I needed to reclaim myself. That night I made a decision, not in anger but with quiet resolve. I would stop giving what was taken for granted. I would rewrite the story of who I was in their lives. And slowly the first lines began to form. On my birthday, I cooked the dinner, washed the dishes, and listened to them laugh in another room. The morning had begun like any other, the sun filtering softly through the curtains, the faint scent of jasmine drifting from the garden outside. I woke early, as I always did, and set about preparing the meal I remembered my daughter loved most, a simple roast with herbs from my small collection of pots on the windowsill. I took care with every step, chopping, seasoning, stirring, infusing the house with the warmth of years past. Each moment was a thread, weaving the fabric of a day I had hoped would feel special. But as the evening came, the house filled with voices not mine, echoing with laughter and stories I wasn't part of. I set the table quietly, the plates aligned with precision, the candles lit to a soft, flickering glow. They gathered in the living room, a circle of light and warmth I was outside of. I called out dinners ready with a voice as gentle as the twilight. No one came. The room stayed filled with their shared joy, their world moving just out of reach. I sat alone at the table, eating the meal I had prepared with trembling hands. The food tasted like memories, sweet and bitter intertwined. Between bites, I heard the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversations not meant for me. I washed my plate slowly, the water running warm over my skin, and wondered when the day had shifted from celebration to solitude. Later, I found myself on the porch steps, the night air cool against my skin, stars scattered across the velvet sky. I thought about all the birthdays I had celebrated with this family, candles blown out, wishes made, embraces shared. How many times had I hidden my own needs to make theirs shine brighter? How many moments had I sacrificed for the sake of a smile or a laugh? The ache in my chest wasn't just loneliness. It was the slow unraveling of a thread I had held on to tightly, the thread that tied me to their hearts. That night I decided that thread was fraying beyond repair. The woman who had always been there, quietly steady, was no longer invisible. Not to herself. I began to understand that love isn't just about presents or gifts or meals prepared. It's about recognition, respect, the simple act of being seen and valued for who you are, not just what you do. As I lay in bed that night, the house quiet, except for the distant hum of the city, I thought about the will I had once written, the one that left everything to them, my whole life's work and savings. I realized I needed to take up my pen again, to write a different story, one where I was not forgotten, not sidelined, not just the maid. I didn't feel anger yet, not the fiery kind. It was a slow-growing clarity like dawn breaking gently over a long night, a quiet power stirring in the depths of my heart. And with that power came a decision, one that would change everything. I once planned to give them everything, the house, the savings, the cottage, but that night I took out the pen again. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the air feels thick with unspoken things, and the clock ticks slow, marking the passage of not just time, but of shifting tides. I sat at the old wooden desk in my room, the familiar grain of the surface beneath my hands, grounding me as I opened the worn, leather-bound journal where I'd kept track of my thoughts and memories for years. Beside it lay the original will signed and notarized, a testament to decades of love, sacrifice, and trust. The ink was faded, but resolute, just like me. As I traced the letters with a trembling finger, I felt the weight of that promise I had made to leave everything to them, my family. The house where my daughter had taken her first steps, the savings I had painstakingly built up, the little cottage by the lake where summers had been filled with laughter and light. It had all been for them, or so I had believed. But now, sitting in the dim glow of my bedside lamp, I saw it differently. That will was not a gift. It was a chain binding me to a future where I was unseen, unvalued, a shadow cast behind their lives. I thought about the countless times my love had been mistaken for obligation, my presence for servitude. I reached for the pen. The ink flowed steady and sure as I began to write a new will, one that reflected the woman I was, now a woman who knew her worth, who demanded dignity, who refused to be reduced to a role she never agreed to play. I wrote with quiet power, each word a declaration, a reclaiming of my own story. I decided to donate my inheritance not to my family, who had taken it for granted, but to women who, like me, had been overlooked, undervalued, and needed a fresh start. Women who deserved kindness, respect, and a chance to rewrite their own narratives. The community center that had welcomed me during difficult times came to mind, a place of warmth and hope. The pen moved with purpose as I detailed every detail, carefully leaving no room for misunderstanding or dispute. I was no longer giving out of obligation or blind love. I was giving out of justice and self-respect. When I finished, I closed the journal and sat back, feeling a strange peace settle over me. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. A silent justice whispered through the pages, a promise to myself that I would no longer be invisible. That night I lay in bed, the house quiet around me, and for the first time in a long while I felt free. Free to be more than what they wanted me to be. Free to own my story. Free to find peace in the silence. I stopped answering their calls and stopped folding their clothes. The silence made them nervous. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first cracks in a window pane before the storm. I would leave the phone unanswered when it rang during my quiet afternoons, choosing instead to sit by the window and watch the light dance across the garden. I'd once rushed to pick up every call, eager to hear their voices, to smooth the rough edges of the day, to remind them I was still here. But now I hesitated. I realized that my absence, My silence was the only language they might understand. The laundry baskets piled up in the corner of my room, their contents untouched, the clothes unfolding into wrinkles, and memories unkept. I stopped folding, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I was no longer willing to perform endless acts of service that were met with indifference or disdain. My refusal was quiet, but resolute, a soft rebellion that unsettled the household. At first they didn't notice. Then one evening my daughter remarked casually, "Mom, can you fold these when you have time?" Her tone was light, but I sensed the edge beneath it. I smiled and said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a fragile thread. Later, my son-in-law grumbled about missing socks and wrinkled shirts, his impatience thinly veiled. When I didn't respond immediately, his frustration spilled over. "What's going on with you lately? You used to be so dependable." I felt a strange power in not explaining. I didn't owe them an account of my choices. I simply let the quiet grow, a presence felt but not easily dismissed. Their discomfort was a mirror reflecting the neglect I had endured, the invisibility, the disregard, the erosion of respect. One afternoon, my granddaughter found me sitting in the garden, hands folded in my lap, eyes closed to the sun. She climbed onto my knee and whispered, "Grandma, why are you quiet?" Opened my eyes and smiled softly, brushing her hair back from her face. Sometimes silence is where we find ourselves. It was true. In that silence, I was reclaiming fragments of myself lost in years of being just the maid. I was gathering strength, piece by piece in the stillness. They asked what had changed, why I was different. I answered simply with calm conviction. I stopped folding myself into the shapes you expect. I'm learning to be whole on my own terms. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was walking it with quiet dignity, no longer invisible, no longer silent, but a woman who remembered her worth. My daughter finally asked why I was different, and I told her the truth with a smile and no apology. She found me one evening sitting quietly by the window, a book in my lap, but my eyes, distant, caught somewhere between past and present. Her face was softer than before, less guarded, and when she spoke it was hesitant. "Mom, what's going on?" "You're not the same. You're different." I looked up, meeting her gaze without fear or resentment. For the first time in years, I didn't shrink. Instead, I let the truth rise gently from my heart. "I'm tired of being invisible," I said, my voice calm but steady. "Tired of being taken for granted. I'm tired of being just the maid." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw the weight of my words settle between us. "I'm still your mother," I continued, "and I still love you, but I have to love myself too. I can't keep giving until there's nothing left." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat down beside me, her hand finding mine. I didn't realize she whispered, "I thought you were okay. I didn't see how much you were carrying." The confession was raw, a crack in the wall that had grown between us. I smiled, feeling the ache soften. "None of this is your fault," I told her. "We all get caught in roles we don't choose. But it's never too late to change the story." She nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. "I want to understand," she said. "I want to do better." It wasn't an instant fix. There were awkward moments, unspoken regrets, and a lingering tension that didn't dissolve overnight. But it was a beginning, a fragile thread of connection woven with honesty and hope. In the days that followed, she made small changes. She asked if I wanted to join their conversations, if I needed help, if I wanted to take breaks. She introduced me to her friends, called me by name in front of others, and even once kissed my forehead in front of the children. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to erase all the years of neglect. But it was a start. For me, it was also a reminder that silence can be loud, that absence can speak volumes, and that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that bring us closer. I still carry the quiet power of that conversation with me, a gentle light in the shadows of memory, and I know now that I don't have to disappear into the background to be loved. I just have to be seen. My son-in-law yelled that I was lucky to live with them, as if I hadn't paid for the very walls he now claimed. It was a late afternoon when the tension finally erupted like a dam breaking after years of pressure. I was folding laundry in the living room, a task I had reluctantly resumed trying to keep the fragile peace, when he stormed in frustration, sharp in his voice. "You're lucky we let you live here," he barked, his eyes blazing with contempt. "You don't own this place. You're just a guest." The words hit me like stones, heavy and unyielding. I felt my breath catch in my throat, a tightening in my chest that blurred my vision. How could he say that the house was mine as much as theirs, if not more? I had paid every bill, every mortgage payment, every repair. I had built this home with my own hands, nurtured it like a living thing, and yet here I was, dismissed and diminished in the eyes of the man who called it his. I didn't reply. There was no point in arguing with anger fueled by entitlement and ignorance. Instead, I folded the last shirt, each movement deliberate and calm like a silent declaration. When he left the room, slamming the door behind him, I stood there alone, the echoes of his words ringing in the quiet. That night, I lay awake thinking about the years of service, the sacrifices, the silent endurance. I thought about the way love had been twisted into ownership, respect into control, and I knew I couldn't let this continue. I began making calls to lawyers, to the community center, to the women who had once helped me when I needed it most. I sought advice, clarity, strength, and slowly I gathered the courage to take the next step. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming my dignity, my freedom. I drafted the new will, carefully ensuring every detail was clear, unassailable. I gave my inheritance to the women who needed it, not to the family who took me for granted, to those who understood what it meant to be overlooked, undervalued, yet unbroken. The day I signed the papers, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in years. The chains of obligation fell away, replaced by a quiet justice. When I told my daughter, her face twisted with shock and anger. "How could you?" she demanded. But I was calm. I told her I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. And in that moment, I knew I had found my peace. I visited the community center and signed the papers to give my inheritance to women who truly needed a fresh start. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain that had fallen overnight, washing the streets clean and leaving everything feeling new. I arrived early, the building humble but warm, a beacon for those seeking refuge from broken lives and shattered dreams. The walls were adorned with colorful murals painted by hands that had once known hardship and now hoped for healing. Inside, I was greeted by a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She led me to a quiet office where we sat across from each other, the papers laid out between us like the promise of a different future. As I signed my name, the ink gliding smoothly over the page, I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. This was not just a donation. It was a reclamation of my power, a gift to those who deserved kindness and respect. I thought about the women who would benefit survivors of neglect, of abuse, of being unseen. Women who, like me, had given everything and were ready to start again. My heart swelled with quiet pride, knowing that my legacy would be one of hope, not bitterness. Afterward, I wandered through the center, observing the small library, the sewing circle, the kitchen where meals were prepared with love. I met a few of the women, their faces etched with stories I could only imagine. One lady told me how the center had saved her when she had nowhere else to turn. Another shared how learning to knit had restored her confidence. Their gratitude was humbling, their resilience inspiring. In their eyes, I saw reflections of my own journey, pain strength, and the quiet determination to rise. Leaving the center, I felt lighter, freer. The house I left behind was still there, but I carried with me a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer the invisible maid or the forgotten mother. I was a woman who had taken control of her story, who had chosen love over resentment. And in that choice I found peace. They came to confront me with rage and threats, but it was too late. The ink had dried, and my peace had settled in. The day they found out was stormy, the sky dark with heavy clouds mirroring the turmoil that suddenly filled the house. Voices rose sharp and harsh, accusations thrown like stones across the room. My daughter's eyes blazed with betrayal. My son-in-law's fists clenched tight as he shouted that I had no right, no shame, no gratitude. Their anger was fierce, a tempest born from shock and wounded pride. But I stood calm, steady as the old oak tree in my garden roots, deep and unyielding. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead or beg. I simply showed them the papers, the will that named the women at the community center as my heirs, the testament to a life reclaimed. The ink was dry, the decision final. They raged, threatened to challenge it, to cut me off, to shame me. But I felt none of it. Their fury was noise loud and empty. Behind the storm I found a quiet center, a stillness that held me firm. I remembered the years of silence, the years of bending, the years of being less than I deserved. And I realized that this was not about punishment. It was about survival, about dignity, about the right to choose who I would be in the final chapters of my story. When the storm passed and the house grew quiet once more, I felt a lightness I had never known. The weight of obligation was gone, replaced by a fierce peace. Some endings are just beginnings, with the noise turned off. I gave them silence, and in it I found freedom. My daughter came alone this time, breaking down like a child begging to understand how she'd lost the mother who raised her. It was late afternoon when she arrived, the house quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the city outside. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she stepped through the doorway. The years of tension, unspoken words, and invisible walls between us finally crumbled in the weight of her sorrow. She didn't come with anger or accusations. She came with a fragile heart, desperate for answers. "How did we get here?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of regret. "How did I lose you?" I looked at her, the little girl I had held in my arms, now grown but still so vulnerable, and I felt a well of compassion rise inside me. "I didn't disappear," I said softly. "I was here always, but you didn't see me, not really." Her tears fell freely then, and she sank into my lap like a child seeking refuge. I held her close, feeling the years melt away, the barriers dissolve in the simple act of love. We talked long into the evening, not about blame, but about healing, about the cracks in our family, and the courage it would take to mend them. I told her I forgave her, not because everything was okay, but because forgiveness was the only path forward. In that moment, I saw hope flicker, a chance to rebuild, to reconnect to love without conditions or expectations. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. And as she rested her head against my shoulder, I knew that the quiet justice I had chosen had opened a door to something new. In the stillness of my own space, I found no revenge, just rest in the memory of who I was before they forgot. The walls around me were softer here, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, that filtered through sheer curtains. The silence was not empty, but full of possibility of healing, of quiet strength reclaimed. I sat in my favorite chair, the fabric worn but comforting, and let the years fall away like autumn leaves settling gently to the ground. The woman I had been, the mother, the grandmother, the keeper of stories and memories, stirred awake within me, unbound by the roles they had cast. I didn't need to shout or fight. I didn't need to prove myself or demand recognition. My worth was not measured by their eyes, but by the love I still held in my heart and the peace I had found in letting go. I breathed deeply, feeling the slow rhythm of life settle into my bones, the soft pulse of quiet justice unfolding like a flower in bloom. Sometimes I catch myself smiling at the thought of what I gave away, not out of bitterness, but because freedom tastes sweeter than any inheritance. I gave them silence, and in it, I found peace. The past is a tapestry woven with threads of joy and sorrow, love and loss. I carry it with me not as a burden, but as a map leading me back to myself. I have learned that some endings are simply beginnings with the noise turned off, that dignity can be reclaimed in the quietest moments. That self-respect is the truest inheritance one can leave. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. And now in the calm after the storm, I am whole again. The house is quiet now, the echoes of old arguments and unspoken hurts fading like distant thunder. I sit by the window, the soft light of dusk wrapping around me like a gentle shawl, and I breathe in the stillness, a balm for the years of silence I once carried like a heavy cloak. Freedom is not loud. It is the whisper of a leaf falling, the gentle unfolding of a flower in the morning sun. It is the grace found in solitude, the dignity held in knowing who you are beneath the roles and expectations others place upon you. I remember the woman I was, strong, tender, full of hope, before the world told me to be smaller, quieter, less. That woman is here, still alive in the slow beating of my heart, in the soft lines etched on my face, in the steady rhythm of my breath. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. They are the moments when the soul breathes freely, for the first time in years, when the chains fall away and the spirit rises like dawn breaking over a long night. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace. Peace is not the absence of pain, but the presence of self. It is the quiet justice that no one can take away, and in that stillness I am home.